Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. This week, bringing you a special American Probation and Parole Association edition. As the voice of the community corrections industry, APPA serves as the field's leading professional membership association. In addition to their U.S. members, the American Probation and Parole Association is supported by international members who are actively involved in strengthening community corrections work in their own countries. APPA's International Relations Committee aims to connect community corrections professionals around the world to inspire and share insights from their unique experiences and best practices. Welcome to this special APPA episode of The Criminologist. And now, welcome your host, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 222 of the Criminologist Podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. In this episode, we are thrilled to bring you an encore appearance from one of our most compelling guests, author, educator, and storyteller, Paul MacNamara. Born in Sydney, Australia, Paul has spent years working as an educator in some of the toughest correctional centers in Australia. With no prior political stance on prisons and limited knowledge of jail operations, he stepped into a world that was as surreal as it was eye-opening. That world inspired his critically acclaimed debut book, The Criminal Class, which Paul joined us to discuss back in episode 176. I encourage you, check that out. Now, Paul returns to The Criminologist with his latest book, Inside Juvie, A Teacher's Story. This time, he dives into the volatile and often misunderstood world of juvenile detention, sharing raw and poignant stories of resilience, trauma, and connection. Paul's ability to shed light on these hidden corners of the justice system is nothing short of remarkable. His unique blend of humor, hope, and heartbreak captures both the humanity and the challenges of teaching in such environments. In this episode, we explore the powerful narratives in Inside Juvie, revisit Paul's journey from adult corrections to working with youth, and discuss how education can become a transformative force for those navigating the justice system. Whether you are in corrections, probation, parole, or criminology, this conversation will leave you inspired and thinking deeply about the role we all play in shaping second chances. So sit back and join us as we reconnect with Paul MacNamara to discuss Inside Juvie, a gripping and eye-opening exploration of life inside Australia's juvenile detention system. And of course, I'll see you all on the other side. Well, welcome back to the show, Paul. I want to speak in depth about your second book entitled Inside Juvie. This book, of course, comes on the heels of your wildly successful first book, The Criminal Class. Paul, it's your second time on the show, but why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners, and then we'll do a deep dive on your second book, Inside Juvie. How have you been, Paul?
Hi, Joe. Well, thanks for having me back on. It's a pleasure to be here and talking to you and your lovely audience. So my name's Paul MacNamara. I'm an author, but I'm also a teacher. I spent 7 years teaching in the adult corrections system in Australia, and I've spent the last 10 years now working in youth detention centres in Australia. And I've written, as Joe said, this is my second book. The first one was called The Criminal Class, and that dealt with the adult system and my experiences in that. And inside Juvie, of course, is dealing with juvenile detention.
Paul, maybe by way of background, and I've already mentioned your first book, The Criminal Class, but that installment looked at your role as a school teacher being sort of thrust into the correctional arena. I like it because it almost is framed as somewhat of a, fish out of water type experience for you, if you will. Talk about that, and then the segue into the juvenile justice system, if you would, please.
Yeah, okay. So, as you said, my experience was teaching in schools, and I also taught adults English as a second language. And then I got the position teaching in the jail. And before that, I didn't even realize they had education in jail. And I had no real sort of political view on jails. I knew people, get sent there. It's not an ideal place to go, etc. But I didn't really think too much about it, really. And then I got in there and started teaching, and it was quite daunting being behind the razor wire and dealing with prisoners, and you're alone in the room with them. But after a while, that sort of breaks down and that teacher-student relationship begins. So it becomes like another classroom, although, you're always aware of the circumstances you're in, and, you can glance out the window, you see the razor wire, you see the guards, you're quite aware of where you are. I called the book The Criminal Class because, one, I was teaching in a classroom, but the other thing that really struck me was, prisons, whether they be in Australia or the US or anywhere, seem to be full of people from lower socioeconomic class. And there was something that was sort of striking to me, was that, Australia was founded as a convict colony. And, there was this idea that the British had that, we've got this criminal class that we'll put to work. And it seemed to me that not a lot had changed in those 200-odd years.
I love, in referencing your first book, The Criminal Class, you talk that it's almost more about social strata or class than a lot of other things we often hang our hats on. I'm thinking here in the States, we're still grappling with race issues, but I often remind folks it's more so class than race a lot of times. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, and as I said, I believe it's the same across the world, all over the globe. It was very striking to me that even, if you go to court, you see like people sort of wearing nice sort of clothes, but you can see it's ill-fitting because it's the first time they've ever worn these clothes. Maybe someone's handed them to them. The people who sort of look in their element are the lawyers. It's very striking,
Let's go ahead and discuss that transition then, Paul, from, as you noted, the adult sphere to the juvenile sphere, which, for those of us who've made that transition, that is a different ball game. It really, really is.
Yes, it is a different ball game. And in the juvenile setting, they said they were glad to have me because of my skill set working. My sort of area is literacy and numeracy. And because I'd worked in a correctional centre, they thought, that's an ideal match. So going into that was, I didn't particularly want to do that. After doing 7 years in the adult system, I thought, maybe it'd be better to go back into a school, get a bit of sort of, a normal teaching experience. But this was the opportunity that came up. I must say at first and I talk about it in the book, in the story of Tommy, but my first encounters in there was, I sort of thought, what the hell am I doing here? And I should get out. But in the end, I did stay for 10 years. Yes, but it was a different experience. And I suppose the main difference was at the beginning is that in the adult system, education is a privilege. So you earn the right to do it. You have to behave yourself. You can be kicked out. And in general, the people I dealt with were adults who got to the point of their life where maybe they wanted to learn to read. There were others who thought, I'm getting too old to climb in windows and break into houses now. I need to learn other skills. So generally they were fearful of education because of their history, and to show up what weaknesses they had. But at the same time, they were grateful for the experience. Whereas then you get into the juvenile setting, and in Australia, it's compulsory to go to school until you're 17 years of age. So anyone who's 17 or younger in detention must attend school. So they have a history of truancy. They have, dropping out of school. I dealt with guys who were 16, 17. Last time they were in school on the outside was when they were 8. So there were big gaps in learning, and they didn't really see a lot of value in the education, but they were compelled to go there. So, and I suppose the other thing is they're compelled to go there. They don't want to be there. So they're teenagers who don't want to be there. So you can imagine, and you've got a class full of them like that. And then if they do give you grief and they are sent out of the classroom, they come back because it's compulsory to do education. So it's a tricky balancing act.
Paul, one of the goals when I started the Criminologist Podcast was to address some of the biases that I saw out there in the way that justice impacted individuals were portrayed in the media, or just the opinions held by the layperson. Talk about your strategy for accomplishing this as well via storytelling and sharing the narratives of those who have walked that journey. I really do think it goes a long way in humanizing some of the statistics that folks look at and really adding a three-dimensional element, which goes such a long way in our reform efforts.
Yeah, and I think that's right, Joe, that storytelling does help in that way, because if you use a sledgehammer to try and change someone's opinion, they're more likely to resist, they're more likely not to listen. I didn't feel like that I wanted to write a thesis. It's not sort of my way of writing. So I thought if I do it as a story, and because the thing was too, as a teacher and as a human being as well, you do deal with these kids who have these histories, and sure, they've done some terrible things as well. But you do sort of connect with them on that human level. And, a lot of the hate around the world is it's easier if you have no connection with somebody, whether, it's a race thing or whether it's, whatever it is. So when you do write it as a story and you bring in some of their background and just some of the conversations that you have, because there's times in the classroom where things aren't happening and you're just talking to these kids. And if you can bring out those stories and you do get to see the human side of it. I often thought too that if I were in their shoes, I'd probably be a lot worse than they were, Some kids, it was always quite interesting and strange in there, because you would have like an everyday conversation, or you'd bring up a topic, say like now it's getting towards Christmas, so you'd bring up Christmas, and kids would start to openly relate stories of trauma and abuse. You bring up a story about a family dog that you had, and, we might write about a pet or something, and then someone's going to talk about abusing animals, or there's all these kind of things in the background that you never heard of. And I remember asking a kid, and I talk about it in the book, have you ever been to Sydney? And he said, oh, yeah, we went to Sydney when we had to go to the women's refuge after Dad had put Mum in hospital. And Dad was an ice addict, and, those kind of things. And, it's easy to demonize people, but then when you see where they've come from, and you get to deal with them on a daily basis, you get to see the human side of them.
I was watching the news the other day, Paul, and a United States senator dropped a quotation. The context doesn't matter, but I just made a mental note of it. He said, every saint has a past and every sinner has a future. And I thought that's so spot on.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah, I always think a little perspective taking goes such a long way. I often ask people to imagine themselves thrust into a juvenile detention facility with their own pro-social backgrounds and just the negative effects that the trauma would induce, and sort of the bizarro world social learning theory, which we know takes place in juvenile facilities. I love dropping this statistic on practitioners that I'm training, but it drives the point home that we're making here, and that's if I'll ask them, hey, listen, if you all wanted to play sort of evil mad scientist, and if you wanted to ensure that an individual on juvenile supervision is guaranteed to propel and graduate from the adult system, what's the one variable that you would do, or one thing you would do to guarantee that? And I'll pose this question to them, and then they'll think, well, I would get that kid addicted to drugs, Joe, or I would ensure that youth joins a street gang, Joe, or I would guarantee that his parents get a divorce. And I'll say, those are all great answers. However, the research does show that the most assured way to maintain that pipeline from juvenile to adult is to incarcerate a juvenile.
Yeah.
You throw a youth in jail, and that's the biggest moderator for ensuring that individual will someday be entrenched in the adult system. And now the flip side to that is, of course, there are those youth who, for public safety reasons, need to be incarcerated, but we really have to use it as a disposition of last resort, and realizing that, okay, if you are going to do that, you need to offset all of those sort of criminogenic things with an abundance of cognitive behavioral interventions, an abundance of pro-social modeling, to offset the perils of incarceration. But we really need to be way more judicious on young kids that we're incarcerating and detaining.
Yeah, that's right. And in Australia at the moment, there's a sort of push in that direction. In one state, in Queensland, they've just brought in legislation. They've called it adult time for adult crime. I'm not sure what the crimes are exactly yet. And in another state, they've just reduced the age of criminal responsibility from 12 to 10. Oh, wow. So now they can be locked up as a 10-year-old. They can be locked up as a 10-year-old in New South Wales, which is my home state. Mm-hmm. And I did see the youngest I saw was a kid who was an 11-year-old. And I suppose one image of that, Joe, that really stuck in my mind early on was that we did have this kid who was 11, and he was, I suppose no other way to describe him. He was a firecracker. Yeah. He was ready to punch on at the drop of a hat. He would abuse the guards. He'd be verbally and physically abusive. But again, you think if that's his natural reaction, what's happened? But the image that stuck in my head was he was being led to an AVL, so audio-visual link for court, and he'd done something in the unit, and they were bringing him across to this other section, and the school was in between, so I could see. And we had two tall guards, escorting this little 11-year-old. He was in handcuffs and he had a spit hood on. And I thought to myself, my God, Australia, a first world country in the 21st century. And is this the best we can do? I'm not saying I have the answers for all this stuff. It's great that there's criminologists like yourself and people who do a lot of research into this. But just as a father, even, when to see that, and as another fellow human being, you just think, obviously, it's difficult. What do you do with this kid? But I don't know that that's the answer.
And of course, I do want to acknowledge we've been talking about perspective taking, the perspective of that correctional officer saying, yeah, guys, but you didn't see this kid spit in my face yesterday or wipe feces on the wall or whatnot. As you were speaking, Paul, I couldn't help but have images of the film Silence of the Lambs in my head when Hannibal Lecter is brought out in that getup. But I was thinking of that same scene with an 11-year-old, rather. I've been talking quite a lot at the show recently about our TIDES model, our trauma-informed assistance model. But within that training, we encourage practitioners to start reframing what they consider criminal behaviors or delinquent behaviors or antisocial behaviors as not just trauma reactions, but we're starting to call them survival reactions.
Yes.
That 11-year-old is behaving that way out of survival. That's a survival reaction. It's not a delinquent reaction, if you will. It's all about reframing traditional ways.
Yeah, for sure. And they were things that I saw over and over again. I remember one time I was in a classroom and we were about to watch something on the big screen. So I was dropping a curtain down, a blind, and I had to walk behind a couple of kids. And one of the kids turned around and he flinched like that, So for an adult male to stand behind him, that was his reaction, automatic reaction. And to me, it would never enter my head that I was doing something that would generate that response. But the alarm bell went off in my head thinking, okay, what's happened to this fella that he thinks me walking behind him warrants that response? And they were the kind of things that kept coming up.
Another aspect of our TIDES training, Paul, along these lines is we remind practitioners to think back to their high school or university days with fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and to start looking at when those behaviors kick in, that's a trauma response. And not to get super wonky, but those individuals have rewired their neural pathways. And so when you talk about, for example, that child flinching, that's a trauma response. That's a trauma reaction. His neural pathways have been rewired to behave accordingly. Hey, Paul, in your book, you talk about intergenerational trauma, which is huge, particularly in correctional facilities, which, as we know, are really, really hotbeds of trauma. That's a great way of looking at it.
Yeah, and they are. And that's, I suppose, another ongoing theme was that everyone who would come, there would be some file on them. And, you would see they'd have a history of trauma, a history of abuse, a history of neglect. They on the computer system, they would have their names and some details, and they had these little flags, they would call them, and next to it, you would see all these letters, and they got to be, something they would call the alphabet kids, because they'd have the kids and they'd have all these letters after their names, and some of them I'd never heard of. Being a teacher, I knew ADHD and ODD, oppositional, things like that. But then, there were FASD kids, so that's fetal alcohol syndrome. And, so that's someone who's mother has been drinking while they're in utero, and not just a glass or two, that's some fair amount of drinking there. And I remember another one I saw was RAD, which I'd never heard of before, and reactive attachment disorder. And when we had training at one stage, they were showing a baby in a cot crying, and they were just leaving the baby in the cot crying, and the camera was slowly panning into the baby's face. The baby was getting redder and crying, and I don't know, but as a father as well, like I could know my kids cry, and there's something primal in there that makes you respond to that. And just watching that was distressing for me. And you're thinking, pick the bloody baby up, or you pick the baby up. Anyway, someone does come and pick the baby up in the film, but then they talk about that those kids, RAD kids, were never picked up, and that they learn not to cry as a baby because no one is going to respond. And then they have no compassion or no empathy for other people. So if they beat you up and rob an old lady or something like that, they're just thinking about, okay, I got that money. They're not thinking about the victim at all. And they've never known empathy, so they can't show empathy. So, just that history of trauma comes up over and over again. Australia has a high incarceration rate of Indigenous people, Aboriginal people. The Aboriginal people, less than 3% of the population are Aboriginal, and 25% of the prison population is Aboriginal. So it's extraordinary. And there's been that intergenerational trauma where people were removed back in the day from their families, where they were trying to do this assimilation policies, which is something people could probably research, but not to go into it too much. But the thing was that those kids weren't parented, and then they're having kids, and then they're not parenting. And that intergenerational thing was going on. We even had, 15, 16-year-old boys who were fathers 3 times over already in juvenile detention, which, and they were having no input into those child's lives either. So, yeah, it's a difficult one. But they're the kind of things that you need to bear in mind when you are working in those situations. And I suppose that's, where the teacher's role becomes in just being that human connection as well, and a pro-social model, and just being aware, I suppose.
Which is great to hear, Paul. We know self-awareness is the critical first step in so much of our progressions that we go through. As a school teacher, Paul, particularly in the context of working in a correctional facility, it's got to feel daunting sometimes when it seems like it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. How do you get out of bed in the morning and in those difficult days?
Yeah, it can be a little bit like that, but you do have your wins, and sometimes they're small wins, but, you'll take them. We did have kids who decided, I will take a vocational pathway. There's a story that I have in the book where there's a kid who steals cars, and he says, I'm good with cars, as you know, and I'd like to become a driver in the army. And he wanted to know how to do that. We had a good laugh about that, but there were the occasional kid who would, take that advice. So, as a teacher, you'll take that on board. I remember someone coming in and saying, what do these kids actually need, And the teachers were saying they need grades, they need certificates, they need life skills, etc. And because of the history of trauma, the person was saying that what they actually really need is they need a human connection, and often as the teacher, that was your role. You were a constant in their lives. There's this revolving door in juvenile detention. Kids might be there for like a few weeks, a few days, a few months, and then they're out and then they come back. And I would see kids, when they were 12 and then, they would be there till they were 18. And I might see them, on 20 different occasions over those years. But they were sort of happy to see you again because you were like a constant for them.
Yeah.
So the teacher's role was to be, that connection. And, I suppose the thing is that the teacher was that constant. The teacher was, they knew where they stood with you. You set your barriers early on. You can't hit another kid in my class. You can't swear at me. You can't swear at another kid. Sure, you can swear. They'll swear. But, if they're directing abuse at somebody, but they get to know that. I remember one time this kid came bursting into the classroom. He was, swearing and saying he was going to do this and do that. And another kid said to him, oh, you better stop because he's going to send you out, And I didn't have to say anything. The other kid did it because he knew what the barriers were. And that kid could be sent out, but as I used to say to them, tomorrow we'll start again.
Tomorrow we will start again. I love it. Paul, as you were speaking about your unique role within the facility, it reminded me of the work of actually an Australian by the name of Chris Trotter, who coined a practice that we embrace in corrections known as role clarification, which in short means that we need to really clarify and take all the ambiguity out of our professional roles, vis-a-vis the client. But I imagine, Paul, your situation is a little bit unique as to your role as a school teacher, which is to say, you're not viewed by the residents or your students as, for example, a corrections officer. Mm-hmm. You don't have that same potential hammer to drop on them. You're in that helper role. I imagine it's a little bit unique in that in that regard, almost as if you're not viewed as part of the quote unquote system. Like, let's say even a well-intentioned progressive caseworker, probation officer might be on the inside. In other words, Paul, is it fair to say you weren't viewed as part of the system as much as those other players were?
Yeah, that's right. And that was evident as well in the adult system. They really didn't, there was the guards in the adult system in Australia, they wear blue and the prisoners wear green, and there was this like real blue-green divide. Yeah. And, as a teacher, I wasn't on either team, So the guards didn't see me as one of them either, So, you sort of walk this line between it. And, as a teacher, I used to joke a lot with the kids. You got to use a lot of humour to sort of break down the seriousness of the situation. And, some kid would get out of line in the classroom and, I'd point out the window where the guards were and say, that's my posse out there, and they'd say, Paul, blah, 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 you're full of it, and et cetera. But it would break the barrier there. So they knew that those guys could come in if it was necessary. But they did see you as somebody different. And again, that thing, Joe, of like being there year after year, you did see that they would actually, at first, kids would totally ignore you and blank you, and then a kid would come back and it's like, oh, how are you, Paul? Like I haven't seen you for a while. And, there was the relationship building and that's the important part of it, really.
Paul, is it a fair assessment to say that you base this book, Inside Juvie, on on your own experiences, obviously, but you had to blend that with some good narrative storytelling. You needed to get some good page-turning content in there. So you struck a good balance there, it's fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. And that was something that I had to, as a writer, had to approach this book differently. With the first one, I did it as a memoir. A lot of the crimes, like if in the adult system, you're on the public record, your crimes, etc. With this one, because you're dealing with juveniles, I had to sort of do it as a story. And I think there's probably kids who could read it and would say, oh, he's talking about me there. But it's probably 100 or 1,000 kids who could say that was me he's talking about.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so I wanted to keep it as authentic as you could get for the reader, and I didn't want to gloss over what it's like in there, but of course to make it a story. And this one I had more of a narrative idea from the beginning to the end of how it was going to be, and it was based on, of course, my life experience and some of the characters there. And there's one character in the book that I actually, at the beginning of the book, I do in the dedication. And he's based on a couple of people, but, it was sort of a tragic thing. And for me, that's the sad thing, was that sometimes, sort of knocked me off my feet was that there were the kids who didn't see any future. They were not even 18 years old and they're already giving up, and I was saying to them, you're healthy, you're young, there's the whole world out there. You're in Australia anyway, your criminal record as a juvenile will not come up unless you commit a crime as an adult. So, I was saying, your slate will be clean, the whole world's out there, and they couldn't see that, from their history. And, that one sort of gets you right in the guts. And that's why I did dedicate the book to Lawrence, was the character in there, to the Lawrences of the world, hoping that, they can see a different pathway.
It is absolutely tragic, Paul, to hear you tell those stories. It reminds me of a webinar that I attended. Some colleagues of mine in the United Kingdom hosted it a few weeks ago, and the title of the webinar was literally Hope in Probation. And I thought, wow, on the one hand, you talk to most practitioners and they can tell you that, yeah, that's the secret sauce for any of these evidence-based practices, any of these core correctional skills to work, is you need that sort of elixir of hope to get all these ingredients to gel. But as we all know, there is such hopelessness in correctional facilities. That is the sort of the grand irony of this, is that we know we're dealing in hopelessness and we're not even seeing it in our official, curricula or best practices. We don't look at lack of hope as a risk factor per se, or those types of things. But yeah, hopelessness is alive and well. And when you tell the story of a 15, 16-year-old who's just wrapping himself in the blanket of hopelessness, it's just really is. It's tragic. It just makes you want to cry. Yeah.
Yeah. The one thing I used to say to these kids over and over, Joe, is that jail is not compulsory.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be your pathway. Sure, you've done things and you've got locked up here, but it's not compulsory. And again, with that intergenerational trauma, you would see kids who's like, well, my bigger brother's in jail. My grandfather was in jail. It's just, with some of them, it's like, some families you have, the occupation is dentists or teachers or whatever, and these guys was like, my occupation or my family occupation is to be a prisoner. And, I'd say to them, that's not your only option. Sure, you can go that way. You choose which way you go, but that's not compulsory. And that fatalism in a 15-year-old is, again, that's where you try to be that hope in that hopelessness, as you were saying.
Yeah, it's almost, Paul, as if it is a rite of passage.
Yeah.
It reminds me of that scene in Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas in which the Henry Hill character is arrested for the first time as a juvenile, and when he leaves the courtroom, he's greeted at the top of the stairs by the adult members of his crew who are applauding him on and cheering him on. Yay, you lost your cherry. It is again this rite of passage, and it's no different with these intergenerational families where, well, my dad was in college, I went to college. My dad was incarcerated, I was incarcerated. Yeah. That's just how it is in our family, you know?
And, we had a situation where a kid was coming to school and he was getting abuse from his family saying, what do you think, you're better than us? You know, and that's a young kid dealing with that from family. It's a hard battle. But I suppose one positive on that too, Joe, is that one kid we had who was, he was a fighter in there. He got into, a lot of trouble, and he ended up going into the adult system, and he came back and gave a talk at Juvenile Detention at some years later. And I said to him after it, that was wonderful that you come here and spoken to them. And I said, I'm really surprised out of all the people, I wouldn't have picked you, And he said that he did time in jail, and the thing that hit him was he came home and kids were running. When he got out of jail, he came home, kids were running up the street to meet him because he'd got out of jail. And he said it was like I was coming home like a war hero. Yeah. And he said for these little kids, I just thought, no, they're going to realise, this is nowhere going to jail. And he came and did that. So he was great. And, that, so that was those kind of things. Yeah. They're the wins that you get. And he was one I wouldn't have put my money on. And when he left, I wouldn't have thought that. But when he came back, and again, he put his arm around me. He was, I'd known him since he was 12. I remember one time in the classroom, there was a kid mucking around, getting quite violent. And I had to send that kid from the room. And this kid, who was the one who came back those years later as an inspirational fella, he said to me in that classroom, he said, if I was the teacher in this room, there'd be blood all over the classroom. So I think that was his way of sort of, feeling some empathy for me. So, but yeah, you have wins like that, and that makes all the difference.
How often do you get those sort of public relations, shot in the arm, Paul, of a returning student saying, hey, I was in your class 5 years ago for locked up for auto theft, and in your classroom I was throwing spitballs, but I appreciated the mentorship and the learning opportunities you gave me, and now I'm living a crime-free life. I'm working. I've got a family. The sad thing in corrections is we only hear about the failures on the 6 o'clock news. The success stories just sort of quietly go off and right into the sunset, and we don't know about those. But yeah, I'm wondering if you get that.
Yeah, and we don't get a lot of feedback from that. Once they're gone, they're gone. He made an effort to come back. And even that, in that system, it was like, should we allow an ex-detainee back into the system? So it had to be approved and et cetera. But, it's such a good thing for the kids that are there. Here's a tough kid, just a few years older than you, who's been through it. He's lived it since he was 12. He'll speak in a different way than I'm going to speak. That's a great connection. So, yeah, that's a real positive. We do hear of occasional things. And even in the adult system, Joe, I remember one guy saying to me that you were the first person who ever believed in me, As an adult, someone was saying that, So, and they're the kind of things that, you can sow the seed and you don't get to see the tree, but, that's what you do it for.
Yes, Paul, 100%. I referenced our TIDES supervision model, and another, as we call them, of our pillars of change is that of resiliency. And I know in your book, Paul, you comment on the resiliency of some of the young individuals that you've come in contact with. But just as I spoke earlier about how the practitioner oftentimes is unaware of the value and impact of hope, talk about from your experiences what practitioners could learn about the value and impact of resiliency, particularly on a young juvenile's trajectory through the criminal justice system. And again, what the practitioner can tuck in their back pocket and learn the value added of resiliency.
Yeah, well, I think that's the thing too to realise is that these kids are quite resilient, given the history of what they've gone through. Because in general, that's who you're dealing with is kids. There's the occasional kid who starts to get into crime for a bit of fun, for something to do, and but mainly it's people from those kind of backgrounds. So I think the thing is that you learn that they are resilient. And I suppose the other thing is you reflect it back onto those kids that, you're a lot stronger than, for you to be here, be in a classroom, accept this help, to want to better yourself. That's quite a lot of resilience against all those outside factors that they have. So I suppose, is just to understand that, to be where they are and to be accepting of help, shows that they are resilient. They can take on a bit as well. I found as a teacher as well that I'd always sort of try and push them further than they wanted to go. They'd say, oh, we're dumb, we're stupid. But, they had giant gaps in learning.
Yeah.
So, for myself, I would try to teach them things without them sort of realising that they're learning and keep on trying to push them that little bit further, because they were happy to just give a quick answer and not look much further into their answers. I'd always push them a bit further. You'd realise when you were up against the wall and then you back off, but a little bit each time, even as an educator, there's one story I've got in the book there, which is based on a real thing that I realised I had a class full of kids who no one had ever read to them in their lives. And I got a novel, and the novel was about a kid who actually gets locked up. And so it starts off with a police scene. And I put out a couple of books on the table and said, you can follow along with me. I'll read it out. And we would do this every morning for 10 minutes. And at first, kids were like looking out the window, looking down at their feet, mumbling, blah, blah, blah. But then as the days were going on, they started listening to the story, and then kids started saying, hey, when this guy's doing that, what I would have done to get away from the police, I would have done this. And then another kid said something else, and, they just started going with the story. And I thought, eureka. So there is that, there is the resistance to education and the resistance to help. But if you can be resilient yourself as well, like take those blows, it's not personally you, and you sort of have to let that go a bit, and then you can sort of get through. And, with that story, I sort of finished it off where I said to the kids, are you happy for me to read the next bit, or would someone else like to read it along? And, they were all a bit fearful of reading in public, which was fine. And I said, so you're hopeful, you're happy for me to read the next part? And one kid said, He said, "Oh, you're a shit reader, but go ahead."
Oh, I love it.
So they're your wins that you get.
And you need to embrace those wins in corrections because sadly, they can often be few and far between. Paul, in your book, Inside Juvie, you talk about lack of resources, lack of community resources as an issue. If you could wave your magic wand from your vantage point now, if you could wave that magic wand, Paul, what would be what's at the top of that wish list?
Well, I suppose it comes back to what you were saying earlier. If you lock kids up, the evidence shows that there's more likely to come back than less likely to come back. So that's probably the one thing. In Australia at the moment, if you get locked up, 80% chance of coming back within 12 months, 50% chance of going on to into the adult system. As an educator, I think if we could embrace trade, vocational kind of education within that system, have more opportunities. They're the kind of things. And I suppose the main thing that I saw over and over, Joe, is that they would come to juvenile detention, they would have their 3 meals a day, they would have a hot shower, they'd have adults who are asking, how are they going, how's their day? They'd have access to nurses, to dentists, to doctors, psychologists, counsellors, and then they would be released and they'd be back into the same situation where they were trying to find food, maybe not knowing where they're sleeping tonight. I had kids there who were like 13 years old in a first world country like Australia, and they had brown teeth. They'd never been to the dentist. So it's just going back to those situations again is, the one thing they really have to change.
And that sentiment is music to my ears, Paul. I often talk on the podcast about the Norwegian prison system, which is really all about what's known as dynamic security. And a major tenet of dynamic security is what's known as the principle of normalcy. And so, for example, I know in your correctional facilities, you talked about the green and the blue, the uniform colors, or as we have it in the States here, guys wear orange pajamas. Well, the principle of normalcy would have us pump the brakes on that and say, no, they should be wearing their street clothes on the inside. The principle of normalcy says that, or believes rather, that the punishment is extracting that individual from their home. The punishment is taking that individual out of the community, away from their loved ones, away from their job. And we don't need to pile on by dehumanizing them in the way they dress or, objectifying them by giving them an offender identification number and not calling them by their last name even. Or other things that make the experience on the inside as quote unquote normal as possible. As you noted, having an embedded nurse in the facility, having an embedded school teacher in the facility, things that make this experience as normal as life on the outside as possible. And when we don't adhere to that, that's why prison is now viewed as an additional risk factor, an additional criminogenic need, if that's the way you want to look at it. And so when we incarcerate folks, we really do need to temper it and realize that we're doing a lot of damage here if it's just for punishment and punishment alone sake. We need to offset those things. And really to get the public to see, too, that it's not about getting a pound of flesh to exact even more punishment and really pile on, rather than playing the long game.
And you can see that it's sort of a natural response. Someone breaks into your home and beats up people and, you can see that the response is like, take them away, get them away. But you've got the brain's then got to take over and say, well, how do I stop that? Rather than, as you were saying, making it even worse, and dehumanizing. And then they do become that way. The harshest prisons seem to make, the most violent people come out of there. So it is that balance. Yeah.
And to your point, Paul, it is difficult. I tell folks, you have a difficult job. We want empathy for the victim, but as I said, we need to play that long game and realize that most people, indeed, and I'm sure the statistics are similar in Australia, but in the United States right now, everyone who's incarcerated in a jail or prison, 90% will someday get out.
Yeah.
And a way to reframe that is to say 90% of people incarcerated in the U.S. right now are someone's future neighbor. And who or what type of neighbor do you want that individual to be? Somebody who was brutalized while they were in prison, somebody that was objectified, somebody that was treated less than human, or want someone who had Paul MacNamara as their teacher and a caseworker who acted more in the role of a coach than of an enforcer. Yeah. Those are the hard questions we have to start asking ourselves.
Yeah. That's a fantastic point, Joe. And I remember when I worked in the prisons, I'd get the files of the prisoner and I'd see what they'd done. And then they'd come into my classroom. And then I thought to myself one day, I was sitting on the bus and I was thinking, I don't know anything about the people sitting around me, and it could be one of these people. So as you say, what do you want them to be? And that's what it's all about, isn't it?
Paul, as you know, I will leave the relevant links for how folks can obtain both of your books. But in the meantime, go ahead and give yourself a little bit of a shout out where folks can find Inside Juvie and or the criminal class, and give yourself a little advert here, Paul.
Yeah, okay, great. Thanks, Joe. So, Inside Juvie and the criminal class are available Amazon in the States, audio books, ebook. If you go to Goodreads, you'll find it on there as well. Have a look. You'll be able to find it anywhere. The big bookstores in Australia have taken it on for this time, so it's good. It's a good read for the holidays, for Christmas, and I think it'll give you a good insight into what it's really like for as a teacher and the challenges for other teachers, not just myself, for the detainees within this, and just give you an idea of how the system actually operates.
You are an amazing mind reader, Paul. I was literally just thinking to myself, boy, this would make a great stocking stuffer for the delinquent Christmas shopper out there. And I just love this as another mechanism of, I always talk about corrections needs to hire a full-time publicist because we need help with public relations. And you asked earlier about publishing, and I have dabbled in publishing, but at the end of the day, I thought, I'd rather get my message out via podcasting and just how you are getting the message out via the written word. I think the key with changing the public narrative is just finding out, different people are going to respond to different media.
Yeah.
And it could be a podcast. It could be either of your books, or, for some folks, it could be a lecture series. But I'm embracing sort of an all of the above approach that we really need to change the mindset of the folks out there.
Yeah. And the other thing that's been really pleasant for me as a writer has been the response that I've got. Like tradesmen have come up to me and said, I never read a book normally. And they said, I couldn't put your book down. I had a 80-year-old Catholic nun tell me she thought the criminal class was the best book she'd read in years, And I thought, oh, my God, there's some language in there. But she still liked it. Had teenagers come up to me saying, they liked it. Men, women, everybody, and that's the good thing about storytelling, I guess, is that it can hit right across the community.
Yeah, storytelling really is the bond that really unites us all together. Paul MacNamara, author of Inside Juvie, as well as The Criminal Class. Paul, I know our paths will continue to cross. Until next time, my friend.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Joe. It's been a great pleasure.
The pleasure's been all mine. Paul MacNamara, thank you very much, my friend. And that wraps up another incredible conversation here on the Criminologist Podcast. A huge thank you to Paul MacNamara for joining us once again and sharing his profound insights, not only into the world of juvenile detention, but also into the broader themes of resilience, connection, and transformation. His new book, Inside Juvie, A Teacher's Story, is an unflinching, deeply human look at the challenges and triumphs of those working and living in the juvenile justice system. A must-read for anyone seeking to better understand the complexities of youth in custody. Paul reminds us that behind every statistic is a story, and behind every story is a person. As practitioners in corrections, probation, parole, or criminology, we carry the responsibility to recognize and amplify these stories, finding pathways for growth and change. It's not always easy, and it's rarely straightforward, but as Paul so beautifully illustrated, even the smallest moments of connection can spark something extraordinary. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with your networks. Let's keep the conversation going about how we can all play a role in shaping a more just and humane system. And don't forget to grab a copy of Inside Juvie. Trust me, it's a book you won't put down. As always, thanks for tuning in. Your support means the world, and we love hearing from you. If you've got feedback, ideas for future guests, or just want to share your thoughts, drop us a line at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. I also want to thank my friends at the American Probation and Parole Association. Today's episode was special indeed as we partnered with APPA, in particular their International Relations Committee, to highlight our global reach with both APPA and the Criminologist Podcast. It is a reminder of the importance of global cooperation and knowledge sharing in our mission to strengthen community corrections and reduce recidivism. We will be back next time with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you can reach out if you have questions about training or the TIDES model or desistance from crime. Reach us at theparagongroup.llc.com. That's theparagongroup.llc.com. You can follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. Lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast. And of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
Australia was founded as a convict colony. And there was this idea that the British had that, we've got this criminal class that we'll put to work. And it seemed to me that not a lot had changed in those 200 odd years.
This has been a special APPA edition of the Criminologist Podcast. Their international relations team looks forward to sharing the insights of other subject matter experts from around the world in future episodes. The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.